She was bleeding, chained, and about to be sold to the highest bidder in a lawless frontier town when an Apache warrior stepped out of the shadows and changed everything. Asterisk, if you like. And share this video your wish are fulfilled asterisk. The sun had barely risen over the dusty frontier town of Santa Loma when chaos tore through the morning calm. Smoke curled from the edges of the timber-bird homes on the outskirts, and the cries of women and children echoed through the canyon. Marauders had struck in the dead of night, leaving destruction in their wake, and in their brutal sweep, a young woman found herself dragged from the only home she had ever known. Her arm burned from a makeshift rope that cut into her skin, her dress torn and stained with blood. She stumbled, weak and disoriented, but there was no time to resist. By mid-morning, the town square had filled with a grim assembly of settlers, traders, and opportunists. The wooden platform in the center, meant for town announcements, had been repurposed for the auction. Behind her, a line of other captives shuffled forward, eyes hollow with fear, faces streaked with soot and tears. The auctioneer, a portly man with a loud, grating voice, began his work, gesturing to each prisoner as if they were livestock. The young woman's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing the sense of hopelessness pressing down on her. She had heard stories of auctions like this from travelers passing through, but hearing the cries firsthand was worse than she could have imagined. Men called out bids without regard, examining the captives with cold eyes, assessing strength, youth, and obedience as if measuring cattle. She shivered violently, partly from the chill of fear and partly from the blood that continued to seep from her. Injuries. Her own mind began to fracture under the weight of despair. Thoughts of her family flashed before her. The small cabin by the river, the smell of cornmeal baking in the oven, her mother's gentle hands smoothing her hair. Now, all of that seemed impossibly far away. She had no control over her fate, and yet, somehow, she refused to let the hopelessness take her completely. Even in the terror, a spark of survival burned within her. Around her, the crowd pressed closer, men jeering and laughing at the sight of misery. Some whispered, others shouted, but all were eager to claim a prize from this display of human suffering. The auctioneer's hammer rose and fell, and with every strike, the number of potential owners decreased, while her sense of danger grew exponentially. One particularly cruel-looking man stepped forward, leering as he inspected her. Her stomach churned as she realized he was likely the highest bidder. But fate has a strange way of tipping the scales, and in the corner of her vision she caught sight of movement. A lone figure, tall and silent, watched from the shadows of the buildings lining the square. The man's eyes, dark and calculating, scanned the crowd, lingering on her with an intensity that made her heart skip. She did not yet understand who he was or why he was there, but something in his presence offered a sliver of hope. For now. The auction continued, the town square alive with the sounds of commerce and cruelty. Yet even amidst the horror, a sense of tension began to coil in the air, subtle but undeniable. The young woman, battered and terrified, clung to the faint hope that this stranger might not be just another spectator. And in the shadows, the watcher's fingers tightened around the hilt of his knife, prepared to act when the time came. This was the beginning of her ordeal, a moment where life hung by the thinnest of threads and where one chance encounter would soon alter the course of everything. The square had become a theater of cruelty, where human lives were weighed like coins and traded without conscience. Dust swirled in the dry morning air, stinging eyes and choking lungs, as the auctioneer called out one captive after another. The young woman was now forced to step forward onto the rough wooden platform, her legs trembling beneath her. Every step was agony, the rope chafing her wrist and the blood from her wounds painting the boards dark red. She tried to steady herself, but the jeers and laughter of the crowd made her pulse spike with fear. Around her, the other captives were trapped in a silent war with terror. Some lowered their heads, refusing to meet the gaze of their would-be owners. Others bit their lips to stifle cries, their faces pale and drawn. She caught glimpses of girls younger than herself, their innocence stolen, already resigned to a fate she could hardly imagine. Fathers and husbands might have died defending them the night before, leaving only the vulnerable to the whims of traders and opportunists. The auctioneer's voice cut through the chaos, booming over the crowd. Step forward. Strong ones, young ones. Who will bid for the finest merchandise in Santa Loma? His words were punctuated by the strike of his hammer, each blow a cruel punctuation mark on their misery. Men and women in the crowd shouted bids without hesitation, their greed bare and unapologetic. Some ran their hands along the captive's arms or legs, testing strength, a grotesque parody of inspection. She felt herself shrink beneath the attention, shrinking into herself like a wounded animal. Every jeer and leering gaze reminded her of her powerlessness. Yet she also noticed subtler acts. A few people in the crowd averted their eyes, their discomfort evident, but they remained silent, unwilling to risk intervention. The market had claimed everyone in the square as either participant or spectator, forcing complicity through fear or apathy. Then came a man who seemed particularly cruel, a trader from the east with a sharp face and sharper eyes. He circled her like a predator, tapping his fingers against his chin as if weighing the worth of a horse. Her stomach twisted. She sensed that if he bought her, she would endure horrors far worse than the auction itself. The rope bit deeper into her wrist as she tried to recoil, but her injuries made her unsteady, and the crowd jeered at her faltering. From the corner of her eye, she again caught sight of the silent observer. The Apache warrior had moved closer, slipping along the edges of the buildings, hidden but deliberate in his approach. His eyes never left her. She felt something strange, a flicker of hope, a tiny ember in a world so drenched in despair. But fear quickly returned, for she had no guarantee that the stranger would act, or that anyone would dare defy the mob that had claimed the town square as its stage. The auction pressed on, each call of the hammer sending shivers down her spine. Her body screamed from pain, but her mind sharpened with the instinct to survive. Every second felt like an eternity, and she realized that if she was to live, she could not rely solely on luck. Yet the warrior's presence suggested that maybe, just maybe, fate had not abandoned her completely. The square seemed to contract around her, the jeers growing louder, the ropes tighter, the air hotter. The marketplace of suffering had become a cage, each captor and captive playing a part in a ritual of violence. But beyond the jeers and greed, in the shadows where the Apache warrior watched, a storm was quietly gathering. And soon, the fragile hope she clung to would ignite into action. From the shadows of a crumbling adobe building, he watched. The Apache warrior's dark eyes scanned the crowd with quiet intensity, taking in the chaos of the auction with a mixture of disgust and resolve. Every jeer, every leering glance, every swing of the auctioneer's hammer was a dagger to him. He had witnessed enough suffering, enough cruelty inflicted upon innocence, to recognize when intervention was required. And in that square, with the sun beating down on blood-stained boards, he saw a young woman whose life hung by the thinnest of threads. He had not come to Santa Loma by chance. Word of the raid had reached him days before stories of captives, of families torn apart, of women and children forced into the hands of merchants and soldiers alike. Where others might have turned away, disgusted or intimidated by numbers, he had ridden toward the town, guided by a sense of honor that ran deeper than fear. He was not looking for glory. He saw justice, or at least the chance to prevent another life from being crushed beneath the weight of cruelty. His gaze locked on her. She was trembling, her body weak from blood loss, her eyes wide with fear. Yet there was something in her posture, a faint spark of resilience, that told him she might survive, if only she were given the chance. He saw the man circling her, fingers tapping his chin like a calculating predator, and the warrior's jaw tightened. He could not allow this to end in surrender. Not this time, but he also knew the danger. The town was alive with armed men, many with nothing to lose and everything to gain from cruelty. Any direct action would invite violence. He weighed his options carefully, calculating distances, exits, and distractions. The rope binding her wrists was coarse and secure. The auctioneer's platform loomed like a stage for brutality. One wrong move and the situation could erupt into chaos, risking not just her life, but his own. Still, indecision was not an option. He could feel the rhythm of the town, the pulse of fear and greed, and he recognized the moment to act would be fleeting. He needed a plan, something swift and precise, yet invisible until executed. His eyes swept the crowd again. A stack of barrels, a wagon at the far corner of the square, the narrow alley between buildings, all tools for misdirection. For creating the opening he needed Dot in that moment. He understood the unspoken truth of the frontier. Survival often depended on instinct, courage, and timing. The auctioneer's hammer struck again, calling the next bid, and the crowd's attention focused entirely on commerce. The young woman flinched at each sound, unaware that hope was approaching in human form, cloaked in shadow and silence. The warrior shifted slightly, his hand brushing the hilt of his knife. He did not yet move into the open, but every fiber of his being was ready. He was the unseen guardian, the watchful presence that might turn despair into salvation. He had no words for her yet, no promises, only the certainty that the cruelty of the square could be interrupted, and that he would be the one to do it. As he observed, the young woman's gaze flickered toward him, drawn by a movement too subtle for the crowd to notice. In that brief, silent connection, a spark of recognition passed between them. She sensed, in the shadowed figure, the faintest glimmer of hope. And he knew that when the time came, he would step from the darkness and into the fire of the square, ready to change everything. The stage was set. The witnesses were many. And in the heart of a town built on fear and greed, one warrior was preparing to challenge it all. The warrior waited for the perfect moment. The auctioneer's hammer rose again, the crowd's attention focused entirely on the rising bid. He had watched the square, studied the positions of guards, traders, and spectators, and now he saw the opening he needed. A wagon had been left unattended near the far edge of the platform. Its creaking wheel loosened the heat. With a calculated shove, he dislodged it, sending it tumbling into a stack of barrels. The crash was deafening, drawing the crowd's eyes and ears away from the platform. Now, he murmured to himself, and moved in a fluid, silent motion. He slipped through the chaos, his presence masked by the confusion. The young woman barely noticed him at first, her mind consumed by fear, pain, and the relentless shouts of the auctioneer. Then suddenly, a strong hand gripped her arm, not roughly, but with firm intent. The warrior's dark eyes met hers, and in that instant, she understood. This was no threat. "Trust me," he said, his voice low but commanding. She nodded, too shocked to speak. He cut through the rope binding her wrists with a small, sharp knife he had concealed in his belt. Pain flared briefly as the fibers gave way, but it was nothing compared to the ache of fear that had held her captive all morning. Free, but still vulnerable, she followed him as he led her toward the shadows of the alley. The crowd was still distracted, many arguing over the sudden commotion, others frozen in shock. A guard spotted them at the edge of the platform, raising his rifle. Without hesitation, the warrior moved. A swift kick sent the man staggering into a barrel, the rifle clattering uselessly to the ground. Another tried to block their escape, but the warrior disarmed him with a precise, fluid motion that spoke of years of training and survival. Every step he took was calculated, every movement a balance between speed and safety. The young woman stumbled, her injured leg threatening to betray her, but he caught her, steadying her with the strength she hadn't expected. "Keep moving," he urged. She did, driven by a mixture of fear, trust, and newfound hope. They ducked into the narrow alley, slipping past crates and carts, the sounds of the square fading behind them. Yet the danger was far from over. Men from the auction began to chase them, their shouts echoing off the adobe walls. The warrior led her through a labyrinth of back streets, across a shallow creek, and into the thick scrub that bordered the town. Branches whipped at her face, dirt filled her mouth, but she didn't falter. Each step was survival, each breath a defiance of the cruelty they had just escaped. Finally, they reached a hidden ravine, a natural barrier that slowed any pursuers. The warrior paused, crouched, and scanned the surroundings. Satisfied they were momentarily safe, he turned to her. "You're safe now," he said. His voice was calm, steady, almost soothing after the chaos. She looked at him, bloodied, bruised, and exhausted, but alive for the first time in hours. Tears welled in her eyes, not from pain, but from the relief that she had survived the auction, that someone had risked everything to save her. For the first time since the raid, she allowed herself to hope. The warrior did not speak further, his eyes never leaving the path ahead. He knew their journey was far from over, but he had done what mattered most. He had given her a chance at life, a chance to escape the horrors of the marketplace of suffering. And in the heart of the wilderness, under the harsh sun of the frontier, that chance felt like a miracle. The wilderness swallowed them whole, a rugged expanse of scrub, rocks, and whispering pines stretching as far as the eye could see. The town and its cruel auction faded behind them, replaced by the sharp scent of earth and the quiet hum of the frontier. The young woman's body ached with every step. Her wounds were still fresh. Her leg bruised, her spirit battered, but the warrior never faltered, guiding her with a steady hand and a calm presence that slowly began to ease her fear. They traveled in silence at first, broken only by the sounds of the wind rustling through the trees or the distant cry of a hawk. The warrior's knowledge of the land was evident. He led her along hidden paths, through ravines and across shallow streams, avoiding main trails and potential trackers. Every step was a lesson in survival, every pause a moment to rest and listen for danger. He seemed to understand the land in a way that bordered on instinct, moving with a confidence born of years spent navigating it alone. At night, he built a small fire in a secluded hollow, careful to shield the flames from the sky. The woman huddled near it, shivering from exhaustion, her body finally giving in to the trauma she had endured. The warrior tore strips of cloth from his own garments to tend her wounds, cleaning them as best he could with water from a nearby stream. Pain flared when he applied the makeshift poultices, but he was patient, his hands steady and precise. "Rest," he instructed softly. "You need your strength," she obeyed, too weak to argue, yet her mind swirled with questions. Who was he, and why had he risked himself for her? Why would anyone care enough to step into a town of cruelty and theft to save a stranger? The warrior offered no answers, only gestures and glances that conveyed a quiet assurance. In his presence, she began to understand that survival was not just about fleeing. It was also about trust. Days passed. The young woman's wounds slowly began to heal under the warrior's care, and her strength returned, though every movement reminded her of the ordeal she had survived. During this time, their bond deepened, not through words but through shared experience, the quiet efficiency of gathering food, the careful selection of water, the mutual reliance that grew naturally when life itself depended on it. She began to see him not just as a rescuer, but as a guide, a protector, and in some ways, a kindred spirit. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rugged hills and painted the sky in streaks of gold and crimson, the warrior finally spoke. "The world out there is cruel," he said, but it does not define you. You are stronger than they believe, stronger than you know." His words were simple, yet they carried a weight that reached into the core of her being. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope not only for survival but for life beyond the fear and brutality that had defined her world for so long. She had been a victim once, sold and bleeding in the town square. But now she was something else, a survivor, guided by the skill, courage, and quiet wisdom of the warrior who had saved her. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, full of dangers, wild terrain, and men who might still pursue them, she felt a new resolve. Together, they would face it. Together, they would endure. And in the process, she would discover that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. The wilderness around them was vast and untamed. Yet within that vastness, a fragile sense of safety and hope began to take root, a promise that life could continue beyond the horrors they had left behind. The sun rose slowly over the distant hills, painting the wilderness in gold and amber. After days of careful travel and hiding from potential pursuers, the young woman and the Apache warrior finally reached a secluded canyon, a natural refuge far from the reach of the town and its cruelty. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers, a stark contrast to the dust, smoke, and blood of the square she had left behind. Here she could breathe without fear. Here she could finally begin to reclaim herself. The warrior guided her to a small, hidden alcove where fresh water bubbled from a spring, and they set up a temporary shelter using blankets, brush, and sturdy branches. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to rest without vigilance, her body sinking gratefully into the protection the canyon offered. The warrior did not leave her alone but gave her the space to heal, tending to her wounds, teaching her to move silently through the wilderness, and showing her how to gather food and water safely. In his presence, she found a rare combination of strength and gentleness, his unwavering focus on her safety both comforting and humbling. Slowly, she began to regain not just her health, but her sense of self, something the auction and the raid had tried to strip away. As days turned into weeks, a bond formed between them, forged not in words, but in trust and shared survival. She learned his ways of the land, how to read the sky, how to track quietly, how to move unseen. He learned her resilience and courage, recognizing that despite her fear and injury, she had endured what few could survive. Together, they were no longer just a rescuer and a rescued. They were allies, partners navigating a harsh, untamed world. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the canyon walls in fiery reds and oranges, he spoke. "The world out there is not kind," he said, "but out here we choose our own path. You are free now, not just from them, but from the fear that followed you." Her eyes met his, gratitude and understanding reflecting back at him. She knew that freedom had been given to her not by luck, but by courage and by someone who refused to let injustice stand. In that hidden sanctuary, the young woman began to imagine a life beyond the auction, beyond the terror of captivity. Perhaps she would return to the edges of civilization, or perhaps she would remain in the wilderness, learning to thrive under the guidance of the warrior who had risked everything for her. Either way, she would never be the same, for she had seen cruelty and survived, and in that survival, she had discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. The canyon was quiet now, save for the gentle murmur of the spring and the wind through the trees. Life had not erased the scars of the past, but it had offered a new beginning. And in the heart of the untamed frontier, under the wide expanse of sky, a young woman once sold and bleeding found her life transformed, not by chance, but by courage, honor, and the unwavering hand of a warrior who refused to turn away. The past was behind her. The future was hers to shape. And for the first time in her life, she believed that hope could endure, even in a world as wild and unforgiving as the frontier.